Okay, so top 10 running backs right now. My criteria for this is very simple. Who would I most like to have heading into the 2021 season? Those are my top 10 running backs right now. The one exception is I'm not including rookies. So rookies out, only including guys who have played at least one season in the NFL. It's just a little easier to be able to, evaluate when I've seen them actually play in the league. I'll start off with some honorable mentions. The number one honorable mention was number 11 on this list, Jonathan Taylor, who I just could not quite get into the top 10, but I wanted to because he did have a great rookie season. It took him a little bit to get going, but he ended up with 1,100 rushing yards at 5 yards per carry. So he had 35 carries that went for 10 or more yards. So he did a lot well, also had 299 receiving yards. I just couldn't quite get him in the top 10. I really wanted to. What it came down to was I've only seen one season. I want a bigger sample size, but he's great. I also greatly considered Kareem Hunt, who some people will probably be mad didn't make this list. You have Austin Eckler, Ezekiel Elliott, Joe Mixon, James Robinson, Antonio Gibson. All of those guys could have easily made this list. Maybe would have, if just a couple things didn't break, a couple things broke down differently. But hey, I can only include 10 guys. So there's a lot more than 10 backs that I like in the league. I can only include 10 of them. So let's get into those 10. Number 10, David Montgomery, probably the most underrated back on this list. I mean, a lot of people still, I feel like, don't pay much attention to him. And I think a big part of it with Montgomery is the fact that in his rookie season, he was really hyped up. I think a lot of people had high expectations for him. Didn't do spectacularly his rookie season, but had a really good year too. Over 1,000 rushing yards at 4.3 yards per carry, which isn't the highest, but you have to factor in, I mean, this Bears offensive line was horrible last year. Big part of it was injuries, but still, that was not good. So getting over 1,000 yards per carry, getting over 4.3 yards per carry, not over 1,000 yards per carry, that would be quite something, and also impossible. Over 1,000 yards total at over 4 yards per carry pace. That's really impressive. Just factoring in the team around him, and still had over 400 receiving yards as well. Number 9, I'm going Josh Jacobs here. The situation around Jacobs is a bit bizarre. He did have over 1,000 yards both of his first two seasons. His rookie season, he did it at 4.8 yards per carry, but last year it was under 4 yards per carry at 3.9 yards per carry. So that's why he's a little bit lower than I think I would have had him last year, just because not coming off of the greatest year too. But at the same time, I think it's what comes down to is you can't just look at the numbers. And when you watch his tape, you can clearly see that it is not his fault that his numbers went down. He still is electric. And when you have a halfback like Jacobs, whose style is, I'm going to run where the offensive line is telling me to go, sometimes when things break down, you're not going to get the highest yards per carry. And also with the run-heavy offense, it means that the yards per carry isn't going to be as good. So it's more of a scheme and team thing. So I would say that he's maybe, if he's not the 4.8 yard per carry guy, he's certainly not a 3.9 yard per carry guy. So he was a tough one to put on this list. I'm keeping him here at 9. Number 8, Chris Carson. I think Chris Carson's really good. He's another underrated guy. He doesn't play a ton. He only averages 4.51 snaps per season, but he still has multiple 1,000-yard seasons and a career yards per carry of 4.6. And again, when you factor in who he plays for, think about 4.6 yards per carry with the awful Seattle offensive lines he's had to play for over the years. He's a really good player, and he can break a long one. There's a lot he does very well. So Chris Carson, I think underrated, very much worthy of a spot on this list. He comes in here at number 8. Number 7, Saquon Barkley. Now, he's another one who I think some people would have a lot higher. I think some people would have not on this list whatsoever. Let's talk about his numbers for a second. He has over 1,000 yards in both of his first two seasons, and he had over 1,000 total receiving yards in his first two seasons combined. So he has that going for him, which means that he can be a pretty consistent 1,500-yard guy, we hope. The issue is just that he was hurt last year, and the injury is kind of a thing. Again, you also factor in the offensive line he's had to play for. That makes things a little bit more difficult, but he still averages 4.7 yards per carry. The only reason I don't have him higher is the injury. I think some people would have him higher, but he's a very good player, and I probably would, again, there's 6 really good backs in front of him, so I know he's 7, but it kind of comes down to when you make one of these lists, there's always going to be someone who you feel like should be higher, but you just can't justify it because of the other guys, and that's the case with a few of these backs. So that's why I have him here. Number 6 is Aaron Jones, another guy who I feel like doesn't get enough credit for what he can do. He has over 1,000 yards both of his past 2 seasons. He didn't have the bulk stats before because for whatever reason, Mike McCarthy didn't want him to run very much, which was just a dumb decision. And, again, no idea why the Cowboys said, despite that, we're going to make you our head coach, but that's a video for another day. Aaron Jones has 5.2 yards per carry. I know the offensive line is good, but still, that's why he's better than Barkley, in my opinion, is like he gets more yards per carry. And the main thing he does that I love so much is in open space, he'll break out a 50-yard touchdown. He'll break out these explosive plays, and I love explosive plays. I love when a guy can completely just change the dynamic of the game on one play. Aaron Jones can do that. He also has 30 total touchdowns in the past 2 seasons. So since they've started really feeding him, he's been electric. So you could argue he's a top 5 back, but there's 5 guys I like more. Number 5, I have Alvin Kamara. He's an interesting one, right? Because he's never had an 1,000 yards rushing season in his career, but he's been a consistent 1,500 yard all-purpose yard guy. So a big part of it is just been his injuries. He hasn't stayed fully healthy with, averaging just 683 snaps a season, which is on the lower side. It's not incredibly low, but it is on the lower side. But there's just a ton he does well. He averages 5.2 yards for his career, so same as Aaron Jones. He can get those explosive plays. I mean, remember that one play against Green Bay where he made like the entire team miss a tackle on him at some point. So there's a ton he does well. He's a great receiving back as well, which does create dynamics that are interesting. So he's a top 5 back in my opinion. Number 4, this is another interesting, this is going to be Dalvin Cook, and it's another interesting guy to put on this list because he's so good when he's healthy. 5 yards per carry, had over 1,500 yards in 2020, and he wasn't fully healthy then. He could legitimately make an argument for being the best halfback in the league. He's had injury concerns. Only 508 snaps per season through his 4 seasons. So that's where things get a little bit tough. He's not like a monster in the receiving game, but he can catch a pass. He has 361 receiving yards. Good chunk of that is through screens as well. So he is mostly a runner, but again, they ran their offense through Dalvin Cook last year, so he is someone who you have to pay attention to if you're going up against him, and that's why he's here in this elite tier. Number 3, I have Christian McCaffrey, who he was hurt last year, but you look at his numbers in the past, and he's just a different animal. So again, I know last year wasn't great. He is the ultimate fantasy football halfback. He's number 1 there probably, but Last year, especially if you're a PPR guy, right? But in 2019, he had 4.6 yards per carry, which is a little bit lower than a couple of the guys that I have behind him. In fact, it's the same as Chris Carson, who I have at 8th, and it's lower than each of the last 4 guys I talked about. But the difference is just what he does in the receiving game. He had only 1,387 total yards. Feels weird saying only, but comparing that to Dalvin Cook and, the guy who I have at number 1, it's a little bit lower. However, what he did differently is just he had over 1,000 receiving yards, and he's a legitimate, he's good enough that he's a wide receiver who also plays halfback. He does both positions, and he does both positions incredibly well. So he's someone who I absolutely think deserves a spot in the top 3. Again, the injury thing is a little bit concerning. He might be number 2 without that, but he's definitely not number 1 in my opinion. You could argue number 2, but there's an injury, so he drops to 3. Number 2, I am going with a guy who I have been talking about for forever now as being maybe the best halfback in the league. Unfortunately for him, another clear number 1 has emerged, but Nick Chubb is awesome, and he really probably deserves a bit more credit than he gets, because a lot of people like to say, oh, it's the offensive line. Well, look at his numbers when he was playing with a bad offensive line a couple years ago. He was still awesome. He had over 1,000 yards last year, 1,067 total yards, which doesn't sound like a ton, but you have to factor in that the fact that he just didn't get as many snaps as some of these other guys. And the real reason why he's number 2 in my mind is the best stat in his favor is 5.6 yards per carry. That's better than anyone on this list last year. So the 5.6 yards per carry is absurdly high. And again, you can say it's the offensive line. Well, Kareem Hunt only had 4.2 yards per carry. So Kareem Hunt's really good. Kareem Hunt's a legitimate, fringe top 10 halfback. I had him as an honorable mention, so I didn't exactly place everybody, but he's probably around 13, 14. And this guy gets more than a yard per carry over what he gets. So Nick Chubb is legitimately a monster, and he is, in my opinion, he's in certain eras would be the best halfback in football. There just happens to be one guy who you can't even really make an argument against. That guy is Derrick Henry. Let's just be honest. Derrick Henry is the best halfback in football. He is. The numbers speak for themselves. Over 2,000 yards, 17 touchdowns, 5.4 yards per carry. So he's getting high volume. He's getting a ton of snaps and still playing incredibly well with them. He's a huge reason they had their playoff run 2 years ago. This year, he did get a little bit shut down by Baltimore, but they also put a ton of effort into stopping him as well. So, 1,500 yards in 2019, over 1,000 in 2018. It's crazy how you look at his numbers and how they've just improved. 2016, around 500, then the next year around 700, then around 1,000, then around 1,500, and now 2,000. If you get 2,000 yards and 17 touchdowns and you do it on a 5.4 yards per carry pace, you're probably going to be the best halfback in football. I really think that I don't know how you could argue anyone else is. Just the numbers are there, the tape is there. Whatever your criteria is for what is the best halfback in football, Derrick Henry meets it. He is incredible, and he is number 1 on this list. So, yeah, that's what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And, of course, as always, thanks for watching.